Thank you, Alejandra. Big thanks and appreciation to Maytree, who has done such remarkable work in promoting civic engagement and participation. And at a very personal level, yes, I am really grateful to Ratna, who called one day and said, you know, that research you did 10 years ago, it's getting kind of stale. Could you try to update it a little bit? So very happy to have had the opportunity to do that. So this is very much hot off the screen, data and material that we've been able to put together. You can see two names on the presentation, my own and a terrific research assistant and associate, Sean Marshall, who wished he could be here but wasn't able to. So shout out to Sean for the terrific work that he had done. I almost managed to go the whole winter without the head cold that's going around. It did strike, though, 2 days ago, so I'm hoping that I'll be as coherent and clear in presenting this material, and if coughing fits come to me, I'll move away from the mic so I don't burst your eardrums. So in a way, I guess we wanted to maybe turn the question around and look at it in a maybe more hopeful way. What do we know about who does vote in Toronto and in Toronto municipal elections? And so I want to give you a quick overview of what is coming. So the question we've asked in this data gathering and data collection is, what do we know about who votes in Toronto municipal elections and who doesn't vote in Toronto municipal elections? I need to say straight off, and this is also a real tribute to Samara, these are hard questions we're trying to answer. To look just, for example, at the City of Toronto, does anyone know or wish to guess how many eligible voters there were in the last City of Toronto election of 2010? How many people are we trying to identify here and get a handle on? Yes, sir. Okay, you're really close. So it was 1.6 something million, and without question, in the upcoming election, it'll probably go to 1.7 or 1.8 with the growth in population. There is no other constituency or electoral race in this country that comes anywhere close to the gigantic number of eligible voters that we have in the City of Toronto, given the at-large mayoralty vote. So we're trying to get a handle on the behavior of a huge number of people. And what we're trying to tease out is, what can we say about the demographic characteristics of Toronto's population and the likelihood that they vote? So we know, of course, how remarkably diverse and pluralistic Toronto's population is. So in a way, what we're trying to get a handle on is, what do we know about gender? What do we know about youth? What do we know about immigrant status? What do we know about visible minority status? What do we know about income? What do we know about geographic location in the city? What do we know about correlations of those kinds of factors and voting behavior? I won't bog you down in the details of research methods, but I'll just quickly say, generally speaking, there are two ways that researchers have tried to answer this. One is to do extensive random sampling polling of groups from each of these community characteristics, and to hope that if you survey and interview enough youth, enough women, enough men, enough members of different racialized and ethnic groups, income categories, that will tell you something about their inclination and pattern of voting. There are a number of complications and problems with that I won't elaborate on unless somebody wants to know during lunch. That's not the route we followed. We followed a geographic, spatial approach to trying to answer the question. So what we've done is, we have looked at the 2003 election, David Miller's first election, the 2006 election, and the 2010 election. We've looked at the election results across all 44 wards and across all 140 official neighborhoods of the City of Toronto. And we have, you'll see, some pretty precise data on voter turnout in each of those geographic spaces, and we have from the census really good demographic composition data about who lives in those geographic spaces. That allows us to then do correlations between, what's the correlation between where you get high voter turnout or low voter turnout and who lives in those areas. So we're taking a spatial approach to this. The good news is, don't feel you need to break bones in your fingers trying to copy down barely visible and legible numbers in tables, or that you need to try to quickly reproduce maps. There's a lot of tables and maps coming. All of this will be on the Maytree website probably next week or so. So that's the approach that we have taken. And what I'm going to try to do as a brief overview is I want to show you what data we have. So depending on where you are in the City of Toronto, what communities interest you, what wards and candidates interest you, you'll have a sense of what data may be available for you to look at. So I want to give you a sense of what we've produced. I, of course, want to try to identify key patterns that emerged. And I really have to say, we haven't had a chance yet to really digest all of the data. We've just put the numbers together, but a few things already stand out that I'll try to share with you. And then lastly, try to identify some of the factors that may be able to raise voter turnout. So in a way, the way I see the goals, the first one is show and tell. The second is analyze what we've shown and told. And the third is where do we go from where we've analyzed? How can we go about trying to mobilize in the city? Okay. Very, very quickly, I would say from what we've been able to do, the key findings are there are significant and widespread spatial variances in turnout in Toronto, and you'll see that. There are the lowest areas of voter turnout are in the inner suburbs of Etobicoke, North York, and Scarborough. The strongest, highest turnout is in the core city of Toronto, parts of East York, and even parts of the old city of York. There is a very strong inverse correlation, and this is really a problematic thing to have to recognize. I know how many people here work with and are committed to immigrant integration. If you look at voting, one of the alarm bells is, from our research, is the strongest negative predictor is areas with high proportions of immigrants are going to have lower rates of voter turnout. So that's an important cue and alarm bell, I think, for us. We were surprised that household income had some positive. The higher the income, the higher the turnout, but it wasn't that huge. Visible minority status was a more significant variable, again, inverse. Something that I think is really significant and important is the third from the bottom bullet. One of the presumed eternal truths of urban politics, which I've taught for a long time, has been tenants don't vote and homeowners do. That's not what our research findings show. So I think this is very hopeful and important in terms of reminding us that yes, tenants and renters certainly can have high rates of voter turnout, and that in the end, the nature of the candidates and the nature of the campaign matters, the nature of on-the-ground community organizing matters. And for those of you who are looking at territorial spaces where you may want to become active, either at a ward level or a neighborhood level, I'm hoping that the material we've generated may be useful to you in giving you some ideas of where you may want to focus your energy. So obviously we're looking at two scales. I said we're looking at Toronto's 44 wards. Just very quickly, to give you a sense of how of the variations across wards, there are huge ranges and differences across Toronto's 44 wards. They differ in size. Some are as small as 26,000 eligible voters. At the high end, 51,000, so their size matters. And is different. You could see their voter turnout is hugely different. We can have ranges of 20% in different wards of voter turnout, which turns into thousands or tens of thousands of different votes votes cast in some wards or not cast in other areas. So there are significant consequences to what the voter turnout rate is in given wards. The proportion of immigrants in wards has huge variations in Toronto. At the low end, there is a ward in Toronto with barely a quarter of its population who is foreign-born, and there's another ward in Toronto with 3/4 of its population foreign-born. So we're talking about huge variations, which you also see in visible minority. There are differences in rental, wards by rent, household income, etc. So bear in mind, when we talk about wards, it's an opportunity for us to try to correlate what's the significance of the demographic differences that exist across wards and voter turnout. This is Toronto's map of its 140 neighbourhoods, and because the 140, generally speaking, there's about 4 neighbourhoods per ward. Some neighborhoods span and spill over and occupy more than one ward, but you can imagine that because the population of neighborhoods is smaller, if anything, the variations become greater the smaller you drill down. Okay, so let's start looking at the ward scale. Okay, so I'm going to start, first I'll present some ward scale data, then I'll present some neighborhood scale data. Okay. The first thing, so this is in the show and tell category. I'm not going to describe a lot of this, but I just want you to know what will appear on Maytree's website. Yeah, thank you. What will appear on Maytree's website. Okay, so this is on 2 slides, a table of every ward in the city of Toronto, and what it shows for every ward is what was the voter turnout and the rank of that ward in the one column is for 2003, one is for 2006, one is for 2010, and then the next column over is when you combine all 3 elections, what do the patterns look like? And then the very last column is 5 demographic characteristics: proportion immigrants, proportion visible minority, household income, renters, and high rises. Proportion of high rises of all residential units. The yellow flag tells you the top 5 wards in each election. The gray tells you the lowest 5, so you can quickly identify them. We also have the name of who won the ward race in that particular election, and if their name is in bold, it signifies they were elected for the first time in that election. So spending some time just with this table, I think will give you an idea at the ward scale of what voter turnout was like in each of the 44 wards and how that compares with the city as a whole, which is the very last line that's on the bottom of the page. Then comes the really fun stuff, which is the mapping. Okay, so this tells us for that column of combining all 3 elections, what was the average turnout in each ward for all 3 elections. Just to let you know, there is then 2003, 2006, 2010. So we've got them for each of them, but and then I'll start just with this first composite map. And for some of you who are familiar with the demographic mapping of Toronto, I think two of the things that'll stand out are the darker the green, the higher the turnout. The lighter the shading, the lower the turnout. So obviously, it's pretty light up on top, and what's been called the U effect. There is something of a U that starts in middle of Etobicoke, comes around southern the lake shore of Toronto, and then starts heading north around Yonge Street and a bit further east. That U captures the areas of Toronto that have the lowest percentage of immigrant population. So it's highlighting that correlation geographically between voter turnout and immigration. So there's this map, there's this for 2010. So this was the last election, and it's especially striking how low the voter turnout in 2010 was across the top of Toronto and stretching into parts of Scarborough. If we then try to put words to those patterns, so what is this telling us? So I've mentioned the U shape. What it identifies is that areas of high proportion of immigrants and visible minorities regrettably correlate with areas of low voter turnout, and the opposite is true. Areas of low percentage immigrants and visible minorities correlate with high voter turnout. And just to drill down into that, and some of this is really striking, if you take the top 10 wards of highest voter turnout, 9 of them had below average proportion of immigrants in the city. So it concretizes. Show me a ward with lower than average immigrant population relative to the city as a whole, and regrettably, that'll be a ward where it is likely that there'll be a lower voter turnout rate. There are exceptions to everything, and the exception here is Ward 26, which is Don Valley West, currently held by John Parker. And the storyline there, of course, is that it has had very significantly competitive ward elections in recent years, with locally based neighborhood candidates mounting very robust dynamic campaigns drawing on neighborhood support. You'll see it includes Thorncliffe Park, and Thorncliffe Park is going to be important when we get to neighborhoods. So all of this is to say, like, nothing of this, we're talking so far about patterns. For those of us interested in urban politics and community engagement, the issue is, can this pattern be changed? And I think things like Ward 26 and Thorncliffe tell you, yes, it certainly can be changed, that these aren't eternally fixed predictive mechanisms. On the other hand, 9 of the 10 lowest voting wards have above average visible minority and immigrant populations. But again, even there, if you look, just to cite one example of a ward that can really transform itself, Ward 8 up in North York, Anthony Peruza's ward. In 2003, it came in 43rd in voter turnout out of 44 wards. In 2006, where there was really almost literally a knockdown, drag-out battle, for those of you who followed it, between those two candidates, it came in 5th. It was 5th rank, and then it fell back again to 40th. I think this afternoon we'll hear about some community organizing that took place in that area, headed by Acorn among tenants that proved to be significant. So again, all of this is to say the pattern's important, but the exceptions to the pattern are also important because they tell us what can be changed and what can be transformed. If you are wondering, this is locationally where the top 10 and lowest 10 wards were, and you see again the reflection. We then did some statistical regression. This is where you actually try to statistically identify how much of the phenomenon, voter turnout, correlates with various individual demographic characteristics. And here's where you see that of the 5 factors we have, immigrant status, visible minority, income, rental, high-rise, immigrant is the strongest correlation at 0.62, which is a very strong correlation. And it's an inverse negative correlation, as I've mentioned. Again, I'm very struck and take hope in the fact that rental is virtually a total non-factor. Rental is is not at all predictive. When you do the R-square, you get, for an individual factor, you get dots and a line that like the one on the bottom. What that tells us is each dot is a ward. What it tells us is there's almost a perfect pattern here. If a ward is going to have high proportions of immigrants on the left column, it's going to have relatively lower voter turnout on the bottom. If it's going to have low proportions of immigrants, it's going to have high voter turnout. And next, I'll just very quickly take you through neighborhoods, and it pretty much mirrors what I've shown you so far, but I think this is pretty exciting stuff here. We have similar data for all 140 neighborhoods. In this slide, I've only given you the top 20 and the low 20, but we have all 100 in between. So depending on where you live or where your organization is or where your community is, you'll be able to zero in on that particular neighborhood to try to find the pattern, the voter turnout 03, 06, 10, and what the demographic characteristics are. This is my favorite map because it has the most colors. So this is my favorite map, and this is by neighborhood. And what this does is it takes all of the 140 neighborhoods and it says, let's do them in slices of 20, where green is highest turnout, and red is lowest turnout, and yellow is smack in the middle. And then you get shadings of green and shadings of red that peel into orange. So again, what you see here at the neighborhood scale, I mean, something that's really striking here is the 401 as a dividing line. North of the 401, you get an overwhelming preponderance of neighborhoods with very low voter turnout. There are some areas of low voter turnout in the central core as well. You'll see splotches of red here and there. So I think for those of you interested in the community scale, this map may give you some interesting information, plus the previous tables that we produced. Again, we've done neighborhood scale at each of the three elections individually. The multicolored one is for all three elections combined. Okay, what does this tell us at the neighborhood scale? And I think I'm getting close to done here. There is huge variance at the neighborhood scale. The smallest neighborhood in Toronto has 2,000 eligible voters. The biggest neighborhood has 28,000. Voter turnout has ranged from 24% to 56%. So it's like twice as much in some neighborhoods than in others. We have reproduced the correlations to demographics that we identified earlier. And if I look at the top 20 voter turnout neighborhoods and the lowest 20 neighborhood voter turnouts, we see the clustering of their correlation to where they sit with proportions of immigrants in particular, and to some degree visible minorities. But again, at the neighborhood scale, I want to say there is also a story of volatility. Again, it's to my point that none of this is fixed and eternal and unchangeable. And so just to give you some examples, there were 12 neighborhoods of the 140 that over the three elections changed their rank by over 100 places. That's a huge, huge shift and change. Yeah. That turnout is not forever fixed. And just to give you some examples, Flemington Park was 125th in 2003. It was 19th in 2006, again with a very strong community-based candidate and activist campaign. Regent Park changed dramatically. And you may be interested to know that the bridle path changed dramatically. It was 24th in 2003. David Miller's first election. It then fell to 109th in 2006, And my explanation there is that the nature of the election race matters to voter. It's one of the factors that matters to voter turnout. If people think that it's a shoo-in, we all know who's going to get elected, why bother voting, that's going to affect, and so that would be my, so the nature of the candidates, the nature of the competitive race matters. These are the top 20 neighborhoods, low 20 neighborhoods across all of Toronto. And these are the regressions at the neighborhood scale for the 5 factors. There's been a fair amount of talk lately. I've got 2 slides left to go. There's been a fair amount, you probably know that Toronto has modified its priority neighborhoods, both their location and their what they're called. They're now being called neighborhood improvement areas. This identifies for you, if you are interested, which are the priority neighborhoods that are continuing as neighborhood improvement areas, which are the old priority neighborhoods that are deemed no longer to be a priority, and which are the new ones. So you can correlate that if you want with the neighborhood scale data and information that we have. And now this is really interesting. The results of the 2010 election. Rob Ford and George Smitherman. Okay. Joe Pantalone won 1 poll in the city. All of the others were won by either Mr. Ford or Mr. Smitherman. The blue tells you where Mr. Ford won. The red tells you where Mr. Smitherman won. The intensity of blue or red tells you by how much of a margin they won. The more intense the blue, the more intense they won. The more intense, so you see shadings from almost pink to red, and from a very light teal almost to royal blue. We have superimposed in all of our maps the old 6 boundaries of the pre-amalgamation municipalities. So you can see what wards and areas would have been in Etobicoke or Scarborough or Toronto and North York. The map pretty much speaks for itself in terms of where candidates drew their support from. And my last slide says, looking ahead to the 2014 election, there will certainly be a heated, contested mayoralty race. I think we can expect voter turnout to be high. It will be interesting to see where there are particularly contested ward contests, and we should expect that in those wards in particular, and I think some people in the room will be contributing to the intensity of some races in some parts of some wards and parts of the city. But all of this does raise some questions of, so like, where should one focus campaigning to try to promote voter turnout? Do you start with the assumption, well, let's start where there's a proclivity for it to be high and make it higher? Or do you say, let's go where it's low and try to elevate it? Or do you say, gee, and of course, those first 2 options carry with them demographic assumptions of who lives in those places. Or number 3, do you base it on geography? What parts of the city might we want to have more of a voice in shaping the city? And maybe should some of this be determined by who our preferred candidate might be and where their base of support is likely to be? And that's where we should put our energies. So these are some insights and snapshots of voter turnout, voter participation in Toronto over the last 3 elections.